an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Haunting of Hill House. Season 1, Episode 6, Two Storms. In this episode, the family is reunited, and it does not feel so good. Dad is talking to somebody. Nellie is hanging around with her broken neck like a creep. Water's pouring in through the roof. Generators are failing. Shit's a mess. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Candace for commissioning this episode. Candace is here in the chat. And thank you, everybody who hung out with me during the live watch of this episode, which was incredibly uncomfortable. I really liked this episode a lot. I think that so far, I'd count the previous episode as the most frightening. This episode was the most frustrating, and I don't mean like in terms of a viewer, I mean in terms of the characters' actions. Everybody is just talking over one another. Nobody is hearing each other. Everybody is keeping secrets from everybody else. And, you know, this is pretty accurate dynamic. Unfortunately, a lot of families are like this. I don't have like a super close-knit family, so it has never been like this as far as I have seen, but I'm certain it was for, you know, each side when they were, before I was born and they were a little bit closer in terms of just seeing one another more frequently and stuff. This whole thing, though, because of the way that this has shaken out, I'm curious, this seems like how it would happen, but I'm curious if there are anybody listening who have gone through this sort of thing where your family becomes estranged from one another, and then there's a particular death that forces you all to get back together in the same place because you just can't not show up. Like, you know, everybody's family is full of people that I think if they were to pass away, you would be like, oh God, that sucks. But you wouldn't necessarily feel obligated to go to that funeral. You would just be like, it would be great if I could go, but I really have to work. I can't take the time. And then there's going to be a death where you're like, welp, guess I have to do this. And you know that you're going to be there, whatever the fuck happens. And I feel like that it's one of those things that's sort of a good thing in a way sometimes, because it makes everybody face one another after they have refused to do so after a long time. But it's only really a good thing if everybody agrees to actually face up to shit, because that's not necessarily what occurs. Some people show, but they intend to come in, make a showing, and make sure everybody is aware they did their part and they came. And then they are going to bail as soon as possible without seeming rude. And they have no intention of actually working through any shit. And like, look, I have no problem if people decide that they are going to bail, because depending on the family dynamic, you are not obligated to make up with your family. Sometimes people are toxic and there is just not going to be a resolution, and you just know that based on the interactions that you've had before. So I'm not trying to judge anybody, but I am saying that sometimes this sort of thing can wind up being an opportunity, because otherwise y'all would never have made the time to speak in person. And if you aren't going to speak in person, this shit wouldn't get resolved. You know, it's not the kind of thing that you can like fix with a phone call. You have to be in person sometimes and read a person's body language to really believe that they mean what they say, especially in the case of dealing with like Luke, who's an addict. He could tell you whatever over the phone, but you're not going to be able to be sure that he's actually sober unless you see him and you are able to, you know, be in a room with him. So this is like, I don't want to say it's a blessing in disguise, because obviously a fucking suicide is also going to tear people up, which is Shirley points out Nell might know. I sort of wonder if it hadn't been for the house, if this death hadn't happened, I have to assume everyone in this family would have continued their lives apart from one another. Like, the last time that we saw everybody in the same place was Nell's wedding. And if I'm not mistaken, Nell didn't speak to her father in any of the flashbacks that we saw. I don't know if he led her down the aisle. We saw her mother, like, standing with her hand over his shoulder. But, so we know that, like, she felt her mother there. But it occurred to me later, was it meant to imply that she was seeing a vision of her father, too? Was he not actually invited, but she simply saw him there in spirit? I think it was supposed to be that he was actually physically there, right? I don't think she'd see a vision of somebody who was still alive. So, you know, the fact that she doesn't speak to him, you get the feeling she invited him because she had to, because that's what you do. But she wasn't excited about it, and she didn't connect with him. Which is interesting, because as we see this episode continue, her father is one of the few people that would maybe understand what she's been going through and believe her. And he's the one that she calls at the final hour, because she knows that he's going to kind of get what the fuck she's talking about. But I don't feel like there was an effort made when they were both still alive to discuss what happened. And I'm extremely curious why not. Does Nell think he killed their mother? Because I feel like after everything has happened, and especially after what happened with Arthur, does she rethink her assumption there? You know, at the wedding, obviously, Arthur's still alive, none of that shit happened, so maybe she's still a little suspicious of him. And then after Arthur dies, does she start to go, oh my God, maybe that's not it. Maybe I've been wrong this whole time. I'm just really curious what she made of that whole situation. Okay, let's actually get into the episode proper now. So this episode, if I am not mistaken, is comprised of a total of 4 or 5 long shots. That's it. I'll tell you guys, I went looking for information on how this was shot, and I was really careful about spoilers, so do not worry, I was not spoiled at all. But I did find a Twitter thread from the director of the episode, who, as it turns out, also directed, something else that had come out. He directed Dr. Sleep, which in my opinion is like a hugely underrated movie. If you have not watched it, I really, really recommend it. It's effective as hell. So it turns out, I think I just love this director. But he describes in this long Twitter thread the setting up of each of these long continuous shots and what an absolutely bonkers amount of effort went into all of it. And he said that, first of all, the rain and lightning effects were extremely expensive, and because they were doing something that was so hugely part of the story, so that it couldn't just be like a background storm, you had to feel the storm, that wound up costing a ton of money, which didn't occur to me that it would really, like, you know what I mean? I just sort of thought you could do that with, like, CGI afterwards. I don't know anything about this shit. Also, he thought that the child actors were going to present a problem because you really have to fucking know your lines when you are doing a continuous shot. You have to get it right within the same shot as something 20 minutes later. So what the longest shot in the entire episode consisted of 17 straight minutes. And he said the child actors knew their lines better than the grown-ups. He said they even knew the grown-ups' lines. That's how completely, like, fucking down they were. And the scene that the father walks in, remind me, is his name Hugh? What is his name, guys? He walks in, sees the like children as if they were back at the house. The camera circles him, and then his adult children are there. They actually had, like, the kids on their marks, and then they ran off screen, and then the adults filed in and stood there as the camera turned back around. And it was a lot of breaks like that somebody had to move out of frame and come back in. Or the scene, for example, when he is chasing his wife in the flashback down various hallways, and that set of the house being attached to the actual, like, the funeral home, that was not an effect. They had the sets physically attached to one another. And just, it was a huge amount of effort. And then they had to have like little trap doors and secret entrances for the stunt double of his wife to come in and out of different hallways. It was wild to read about. I was fascinated by it. And you can see how worth it was in this episode. It just, for me, this single camera thing, it's one of those tricks that I think can be overrated sometimes. People talk about it like it in and of itself. Having everything in one shot is just like so impressive that it can make up for a bad scene. I do not agree with that. And that, I mean, I'm covering Loki right now with Owen for the wedding fundraiser. And the final scene in the 3rd episode is all one shot. And for me, that was a mess. It didn't work at all. It was incredibly disorienting and not in the way they intended. It didn't work. And I feel like it was kind of a waste. In this episode, it makes everything feel so much more claustrophobic. It makes everything feel connected to each other in a way that is continuously like unnerving, also a little bit surreal, but in the way that it can be when you are experiencing something that is heightening your emotions. I don't know if you guys have gone through this sort of thing before, but extreme grief or shock or fear can make everything sort of feel like a dream. And there is something like that happens when you're using a single shot that makes it feel dreamlike. And I just, combined with like the shadowy corners in the funeral home, and occasionally Nell shows up, but then she's gone again. I was really, really into it. I just felt like this was so beautifully done and such an effective episode for the reunion of this family. And especially when you're in Hill House and the camera is circling, there's this feeling of you being whatever's in the house watching them. Like you are the thing spying. It's almost in the same like atmospheric sense as the camera following around the little boy on his tricycle riding down the hallways of the hotel in The Shining, where just the slight distance of the camera behind the kid makes you feel like he's being followed. Even though it's you watching, you're like, yeah, this isn't good. No, I don't like this perspective because it's making me anxious. And I feel like that's exactly what they accomplished with the camera work here. Ariel says, I wonder if they had to be very quiet while running to and from their marks too. Oh yeah, he was talking about that as well, that like the noise from different things was a huge issue. And especially because they were trying to accentuate the storm noises, you couldn't have things like competing with that. It was fascinating. I really recommend finding the thread. So anyway, this whole thing is really heart-wrenching when you get down to it, because like I said, you want this to be the moment that people take an opportunity to really talk to one another. And they do to an extent, but not in a way that is like helpful. Nobody's receptive. The outing of certain secrets, for example, the taking of the money by both Theo and unknowingly Shirley, if that does come to light. But then the main issue, which is everybody feeling like their father's been lying to them, or at least everybody, it's clear that Shirley and Steve feel that way. I get the feeling that Luke did feel that way until recently, and he's starting to get it. And Theo, I don't know what she thinks because she's so closed off about it all. I am sure, like, Theo clearly knows more was going on than met the eye, but I cannot tell how much she blames their father for it. It's hard to say, because she redirects her anger at everybody else so much, and she seems to avoid any real, like, back and forth with her father at all. Okay. The episode begins with Shirley getting Nell situated in the casket. And I was saying during the episode that I wonder what it is like to be the actress who has to be in the casket so much of the time. And I think somebody in the chat said I thought it was a dummy, and apparently it was a dummy some of the time when the camera was far from her. But when it's zeroed in, that is the actual actress. And, you know, they had to have a dummy for the casket when Nell, as the bent neck lady, is standing next to it so that it looks like there's two of her. So yeah, she was definitely like in the casket chilling for a lot of this episode. And Theo is standing next to the casket watching Shirley work, talking about how people say it looks like they're sleeping, but she doesn't look like she's sleeping. She looks dead. You did a really good job, but it doesn't look like she's sleeping. And we see Theo really drinking this is the kind of drinking that I just can't wrap my head around. Because I'll tell you what, guys, I have 2 shots and I am on the edge of throwing up. You know, depending on how much I've eaten, you know, of course that's all going to like be a factor. But for me, 3 drinks like this and I'm drunk. Easy. I cannot fathom being able to drink as much as she's drinking and apparently not eating with it. And being able to even stand. You know, I just can't drink like this. So I always watch it with a sort of fascination where I'm just like, I know this is bad for you, like just in principle and everything, but I would really be dead. How do you do it? And I've seen people who can, and God knows I read enough books where it's like people fucking have cocktails with every meal. And I'm always like, is that possible? Does the person writing this do it? But Theo is really not coping well. And it's no surprise because she touched Nell and saw something. I am dying to know what she fucking saw. I really am, because did she see the house in like faking everything to her sister? Did she see her mother pushing her off the edge of a balcony? Or did she see the truth? Like everything was sort of seen a certain way through Nell's eyes, but then it sort of seemed like she came back to herself for a moment. So did Theo see that? Did she see the fact that it turns out Nell was the bent neck lady through all of time? Like, how much of it did she actually absorb? I'm super interested, and I'm so annoyed that we still don't know. And she's like asking Shirley, how bad was it when she got here? How did she look? And Shirley's like, are you seriously wanting to know? And Theo's like, you're right. No, I don't. So I thought that this was the start of like the actual funeral or wake. I'm not sure if this family would have a wake, because as far as I know, wakes are really like more of a Catholic thing. Not to say that, you know, people of other denominations don't do them, but that's what I associate them with. And they, it turns out, are having like their own viewing with just the family. I'm like, is that because those are the only people that they're allowing to see now? Or is this the preliminary and then they're going to have a real funeral? It doesn't really seem like Nell had many people in her life, but I don't know what she did for a living. I don't really know. I don't know. But yeah, so we've got, what is Shirley's husband's name again? Phil, Kevin, Hector. I don't know where I'm coming from with all these different names, but yeah, he is waiting on everybody and kind of overwhelmed with how much food has been sent, which is part of why I was like, there has to be like more people that they're going to invite to an actual funeral, because they're getting sent all this food, which tends to happen when you have friends and family who support you and would have turned up for the wedding or the funeral. But yeah, she says, did you connect with a florist for tomorrow? Okay. So yeah, they're going to have a real funeral, but this is just like the thing with family. So this is when Luke and Steve show up. And everybody is expecting Luke to be high or just in a bad place because of the fact that he bailed from rehab, and are all sort of pleasantly surprised at the fact that he's sober and he's been sober. Like, this is not day one or anything. I also really enjoy Theo walking right by Steve to go get some food when he comes in. It looks like she's coming to greet him, but instead she just fucking, like, does a little bit of a sidestep and goes for the fucking buffet table. And I was like, that is a whole mood right there. So keeping in mind the fact that this episode is the first time that we are seeing Steve since the death, other than a few short scenes with him and Luke, with him calling Shirley, he has a very distinct reaction when he gets here. He kind of is joking around like, oh, still not a hugger with Theo. But then you see him look up and see Nell in the casket and back away and really start breathing hard. And he's trying to hide it. He's trying to cover it up. But obviously, seeing somebody the way he saw Nell, it's not just like, oh yeah, she was standing there. Like it was Nell was there and then she was gone. She was standing there, and then she was right in front of you. And then she was screaming and turning black, and her face was falling apart. That's different. And he, understandably, has not got over it. And that is apparent throughout the episode. Because as much as Steve is trying to act as if everything that he is feeling is, like, on behalf of the welfare of the family or on behalf of Luke, it's actually all about him. Because that's just Steve, right? So he tries to be like, hey, it's okay, buddy. We can do this together. And if it's too much, we can leave, to Luke. But it's more him doing the brave face for someone else when really it's for him. And I'm not even trying to be like shitty about that, because I know for me, that's a lot easier to do. You know, for example, I'm going to be going to see Candace this weekend to help her build some furniture. And God knows that I could have furniture at my house. I don't, but let's say I could have furniture at my house that is half put together that I'm avoiding putting together. And I would just be like, ugh, I'll get to it. But Candace is like, hey, can you help me put together furniture? And I would just be like, yeah, absolutely. Let's go put together furniture. I'll fucking have your furniture put together in 2 hours. It's so much easier to do shit and like be focused on behalf of somebody else than it is for yourself sometimes. And that's just fucking how it is. Same thing with just like being the assertive person at any given time, like against family members or in a situation where they really need to stand up for themselves. If they can't, standing up for them on their behalf is so much easier than standing up for yourself. So to a degree, I relate and I can almost admire the fact that he is able to redirect that energy and sort of give that strength to Luke. Even if Luke doesn't really get what's happening, I'm sure he feels supported. So that's okay. But later on, when he's yelling at their father about how you keep hidden everything about mental illness in our family, what's really happening there is that Steve thinks he's losing it. That's what he thinks that vision was. He doesn't really believe that it was a ghost. Or if he does, he's not letting himself believe it. That might be in his mind as like a bit of a tickle, but he is rationally shoving it away and making sure that it doesn't surface so that he can instead focus on his rage towards his father. Because it's so much easier to be angry than it is to be scared. Being angry is always preferable. I think that's what most of us choose most of the time, is anger rather than fear. And they can look very similar, you know? But if you're going to have to choose between A, it turns out I was wrong and ghosts are real, which opens a whole new fucking world of shit you don't understand or know about. Or my dad's a liar and I may have a mental illness that he was hiding from me. That's way easier. That's something in particular to focus on for yourself that's solvable, that's a person that you can direct your anger towards, that's so much simpler in its way. And it's just no surprise that somebody like Steve would choose that in the face of everything. And also, it's a good redirect of grief, too, you know, and guilt. Because if he was wrong, and there are ghosts, that means that he gaslit his sister, brothers and sisters, maybe even a little bit his father and mother, depending on how things went. And now he has to deal with, like, figuring out he was wrong and unfair after she died in an apparent suicide due to people not believing her. Which, yeah, again, you would definitely choose to be angry at your father. Because you can blame him not only for the fact that you are experiencing that mental illness, but for your sister's death. Instead of having to carry the guilt of the fact that maybe you were wrong about everything and profited off of her trauma, which, you know, I mean, it's certainly already awful if it is mental illness that he profited off of that. But it's a whole other thing if he's been riding this high horse and then he finds out that he was wrong about everything. I will be honest, you guys. I don't know how the series is going to end. There's, 4 more episodes after this. If it turns out that Steve doesn't realize he was wrong and doesn't, for sure, figure out that these ghosts were real, all of this was real, I'm going to break shit. I cannot be okay with an ambiguous ending where Steve is still left feeling like, well, who knows? He better fucking get taught. I'm just saying. I need it. Okay? I need it. And this is one of those things, whenever you, I don't know how many of y'all watch these shows, but I used to be really into them as a kid, the stories of like real hauntings and people talking about their time in houses and the things that happened to them. And they'll interview all of the family members that lived there at once, separately. And every time there is a dude, and it's always a fucking dude, who is like, I didn't see anything, I don't know, it was just obviously the wind. Every time. And meanwhile, the other fucking 7 people who lived in the house are like, the wind? My door flew open and shut 6 times. Oh yeah, it's the wind. And every time I'm just like, how? I understand wanting to be rational, but you're taking rational to the point back around. You're circling to irrational again. And Steve is just really playing that role for me. And I need the like fantasy situation, because in those interviews on those shows, that person never actually thinks that they were wrong. There's been 1 or 2 that I watched where they were like, eventually something so bananas happened that even they were like, okay, something is up, maybe we should move. But it was rare as hell. And I need that gratification and validation. I need Steve to be like, I was completely fucking wrong, holy shit. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how Steve reacts to that. I don't even care. I just want to see it. Even if he dies, like, okay, guess he dies. So this this moment where Luke turns up, he just looks so incredibly flipped out. And his acting is so good here. He can't take his eyes off her, and he's staring, and then finally turns away and goes back sort of into the lobby and is just like, I can't do this. And, you know, there's a moment when everybody's sort of like, what's going on with him? And then Steve tells them, it's not what it looks like. Actually, he's doing better than we thought, and he's still clean. So then we have the moment when Hugh shows up. And I kind of skipped over the spot where Steve leads Luke down to see Nell. I forgot. That's her, detective. That's positive ID. That's Nellie, all right. And she's dead. Oh my God, Steve, you are not doing well, buddy. But yeah, so this is the moment that their father shows up. And it really makes sense that after seeing her and reacting the way that he does in that moment, his father arriving here when he's just like contemplating his own fucking like mental state and wondering what happened to me, he would be particularly unreceptive. I'm looking, guys, just as a sort of design point. This whole, I've already talked about the sickly coloring of this funeral home. And to a degree, it's clearly also like due to a filter and lighting choices, because everybody is very washed out and we've got them all dressed in shades of blue and black and khaki. It's all really muted and sort of like in the same color palette as the funeral home itself. But Nell is in red, bright red, which I don't know if that's meant to like tie her to the red room, but it is sort of an odd choice to me, like that Shirley would dress her in red. I wonder if it's just like, oh, this was one of her favorite outfits or something. I wonder if I were to die, I would really love to know what Owen would choose to have me buried in. What colors would he pick? What outfit would he pick that he would be like, this was her favorite thing. She loved this outfit. I feel like maybe I should really like specify that if I could draw up some like death documents and make my wishes known. But I guess I'm going to be cremated because burial is expensive and just kind of ridiculous. So it doesn't matter. But yeah, her choice to like dress Nell in red, I totally get that that's really meant to be a design choice so that she stands out in this episode. But it felt weird to me to think like, yeah, but Shirley dressed her. You know what I mean? But it could also be like something that it's meant to be a signal that maybe Shirley subconsciously knows what's going on and dressed her in red because she was unknowingly associating her with the red room. Oh my God, Patrick's in the chat. Can we also mention that Steve let their dad fly Coach? I forgot about that. Technically, he didn't. His dad insisted on paying for his own ticket and he could only afford Coach. I have to assume that I can be nice and be like, Steve was already planning on flying Coach. Or I can imagine that he's like, no, I'll pay for my own ticket. And Steve's like, oh, will you? Well, fine. And he chooses to fly first class specifically because he knows their dad can't afford it and that will get them away from him. I don't actually think that's what happened, but Steve feels like that kind of petty that he would. And he's laughing at the fact that his dad was in Coach and they're all sort of like smirking to each other about it. Nobody seems to fault Steve for it. They all just are a little bit surprised at the balls he's got. But so this is really this is the first time that we're seeing him, Hugh, with his kids. Like I said, the first time that we see him, he is seeing his little children standing there. And then the camera circles back around again, and it's his grown kids. And there is more than one instance this episode where he is sort of murmuring to apparently somebody that is standing next to him. And I don't know what to think. My instinct is that it's his wife. That she is standing there with him, talking with him about what's happening and trying to like, but it could be somebody totally unrelated. It could be a figment that followed him from the house, like the bowler hat man with Luke. I mean, I want to imagine that it's something that's sort of helpful and on his side, but there's no reason to think that necessarily, you know? And I'm also dying to know whether or not whatever it is that he is seeing has been with him since the day of their mother's death when they left, or did it begin to manifest after and has sort of stuck around since? Is it recent even and only begun to show up? Like, is it Nell? I don't think it's Nell, because like that, it occurred to me maybe it's just happened since she died and she's with him and he's talking to her. But when he sees her as the bent neck lady, he says her name in a way like he hadn't seen her recently. And I don't feel like if it was her ghost standing next to him, that his reaction to her, like standing there in the funeral home, makes as much sense. So I don't think it's her, but if it hadn't been for him seeing her ghost there, I might have gone with that. I don't know. But yeah, this whole thing too, and the way that he just doesn't really finish any sentences. He's really quite good. I was a little bit worried. I don't know if you guys have seen this actor in other things. He's been in a million things. But what I really know him best from is the show Leverage. And he plays such a sort of slick customer in that when I saw that he was going to be their dad, my instinct was just like, oh, that's not right. That's not good casting. Like, I just didn't see him being able to pull off a vulnerable, haunted kind of person. And I am pleased to say that I was wrong about that. You really feel for him in this scene, especially the fact that he can't finish sentences. I mean, you could put it down to the fact that something is standing next to him, fucking talking to him. And so he keeps maybe trailing off because he's trying to listen to whatever is speaking to him. But I was very strongly reminded of the dad from Fleabag. For those of you who have seen that show, and if you haven't, please, it's one of the best shows I've ever seen. Please watch Fleabag. But the father in that never fucking completes sentences. It's really something. That all of that dialogue is truly astonishingly good. But he was sort of reminding me of that, except he's not infuriating with it. He's just much more like, he just feels, it's less like he's scattered and doesn't like confrontation and doesn't really like to commit to sentences. And it feels more like he thinks he finished that sentence. It's like he's not in his body. There's this weird sense of disconnect there, you know? So, and it's really notable that his family comes in, like, his family, really, I should say, Kevin, Theo, and Shirley walk up to him. They do not really, if I'm not mistaken, embrace him. Nobody does. He just comes in soaking wet. He hands his jacket over to Kevin. And other than that, there's like no contact with anybody, which is really, just tells you everything you need to know about how things are between him and his kids. And he goes up to the casket and we see baby Nell in the casket instead for an instant, which is just really upsetting. She's just so round-faced and so cute. She's like a very adorable child. And the camera circles around and we see his whole family standing in the funeral parlor behind him. The ones closest to him, Shirley's the closest, followed by Kevin and Luke. And then way further back are Theo and Steve, who are standing sort of next to one another. And then at the very back is Nell as the bent neck lady, just standing watching. And this becomes all the sadder because, of course, it's creepy to see her in the shot, to see her appearing here and there, especially because everything is one shot. The camera circles wildly, and you always assume it's circling in that fashion so as to show you something standing there. And so when there isn't anything standing there, that's almost worse. But later on, we find out that Nell like vanished into another dimension briefly when she was in Hill House and thought that she was in the room with everyone yelling and couldn't understand why they didn't hear her and didn't see her. And so when you see that scene at the end and you realize that Nell is in the funeral parlor with everybody, so much of the time in this episode, it takes a totally different tone and it turns the corner from just being creepy to being really heartbreaking. There's no sense of her trying to reach out. She's not attempting to speak. She's not moving in a way as if she's like trying to get anybody's attention, but she is there. And because she is there, it feels like that in and of itself is an attempt. Maybe she can't move. Maybe there's a bit of that same sort of paralysis as the sleep paralysis going on because of her broken neck. So all she can do is stand there. But there's a sense of her wishing she could be seen almost, you know, although I'm sure she wouldn't, because she wouldn't wish that, because I think she knows that everybody would be really scared by it. But she appeared to Steve for a reason. She appeared to Luke for a reason. I would love to know still why she appeared to Steve. What was it she was trying to say? It sounded like she was trying to say mom, but maybe she wasn't trying to say anything. Maybe it was just meant to be real creepy. I don't know. So this is the point when Hugh asks for directions to the bathroom, and Shirley points him down the hallway, and he takes a corner and he winds up in Hill House. And guys, I just have to say, this bit of filming was really something. Like I said, the camera's like following him down an actual set hallway that actually connects to Hill House's set. So that flawless movement into this new home or new set is like genuine. And it's really, really creepy because it looks like that's what's about to happen. But as you're watching it, you're like, that can't be right. It's going to like turn into something else. And it does turn into a flashback. But initially, the way he's looking around, it really feels like, no, he's in Hill House for sure. He is there and he sees all of this too. And then we have the fucking dropping of the chandelier, and he jumps like a foot in the air. And then we get the actual flashback. Him watching himself walk down the stairs in reaction to this noise. And that is the sort of like centerpiece of this entire episode, is this front entryway and the chandelier having fallen due to the storm. And this scene begins really interestingly because this apparently woke him up, but he turns around and he sees his wife coming down the stairs, and he's like, where were you? And she doesn't know. She seems a little bit confused, and she just says, I must have been wandering around. She says, I guess I must have been. But you see her looking confused as she says it, and then saying, I had the strangest dream, and they get interrupted. And I'm like, but I really, really want to know what her strange dream was, though. Like, what is she going to say? I was having a tea party with a little girl named Abigail. So the storm is practically a fucking other character in this episode. It is a force that feels like it is joining up with the sinister presence of the house itself. And everything that happens with it being like a series of events that are extreme, it almost seems like the house is like drawing power from the storm somehow. Do you know what I mean? Because there's just a sense of everything being heightened in a way that it isn't normally. Because everybody experiences something weird during this. And it just all ends with the sort of climactic event of Nell disappearing and then reappearing in a different spot as if she'd never left. So they move the chandelier out of the way, and everybody begins to come downstairs into the hall because they heard the noise of it falling. They hear the hail starting, and it's clear that this is going to, like, you know, be a bad scene for redoing this house. And the power is beginning to flicker in and out, and eventually does just go out completely. And there's this bit when they are all gathering together, and I couldn't help but laugh because it's when the lights first go out, and Nell is standing off to the side in such a way that at first it just looks as if she's trying to decide who she's going to go to. And her father sort of walks by her and puts a hand on her chest as if to just get her slightly out of his way, but pushes her towards that, like, sunroom area. And then she is running towards it, but she's spinning. And there's a real sense of she did not choose to be in the sunroom. It feels like something pulled her into it. And there's a flash of lightning, and she sees the bent neck lady standing there, and she screams, and her mother comes and gets her. I don't know if we saw this moment, like her in the green room, the sunroom, in the flashbacks when she's realizing that she's the bent neck lady. But nevertheless, this just is one of the first moments where it feels like the house is trying to, like, lure Nellie somewhere. And we get everybody gathered in a circle working on the flashlights because the power has gone out. And they set Nell and Theo off to the side. Theo holding Nell's hand, and they work on putting new batteries and everything with the assumption that they are going to then turn around and hand everything back out. And as I'm watching this, I'm like, Nell and Theo are way too far away. There is no reason for them to not be part of this circle of everybody putting new batteries in. So clearly something is going to happen. And at one point you hear Nell say, "Stop it." The way that you would say to somebody who's, like, poking and prodding at you, it, for me, really gives the sense of, like, she is getting pulled by somebody or something. She's getting, like, something is trying to take her. And when the camera circles back around for a second, it looks, at first glance, and I'm not sure if I'm right about this or not, so if anybody knows, you can tell me because I don't think it's a spoiler. But the camera circles again, and in the background you see the two pairs of feet and hands. And Nell is still holding Theo's hand. It looks like. But the little girl holding Theo's hand does seem taller, I think, than the last time we saw Nellie. So it may not be Nellie by then. Because Theo says something like, I could feel her hand. She was standing right here. I felt her. And I am certain that she's right about the fact that she felt somebody. But I have to think that something, like, took Nellie's place to fool Theo. And Theo's got her gloves on here. So there's no reason that she would have been able to sense that it's a different person now. But like I said, I may be mistaken on that. It may have been the same actress the whole time. God knows that they have enough to do in this one single take without replacing Nellie with a different actress. So they may not have even done that. But yeah, they eventually, Olivia turns around and Nellie is gone. I really appreciated that she doesn't blame Theo for this, because I thought for sure that this was going to trigger another bit of Olivia being super enraged the way she was about the writing on the wall. And instead, she immediately is like, "It's okay, sweetie." Like, she doesn't blame Theo at all. And that really was sort of a weight off my mind. So thus begins the search for Nellie throughout the house. And of course, as soon as this starts, I'm already like, oh, I don't like this at all, because everybody has to split up. And so the only thing that they do, they keep the kids in the main room, but nevertheless, I was still like, they might go off on their own though, because these kids, they do wild shit in this house that I would never. But even staying together, they still have something happen. Later on, they saw something like a huge dog, as they put it. I think Theo says that it had glowing eyes, and Steve's like, I didn't see glowing eyes, but I definitely did see something run in towards the kitchen. They all scream. Clearly, whatever it was really fucking flipped them out. And the fact that Steve saw it too, I find to be particularly interesting, because evidently he just is going to tell himself that that was a real dog that like somehow got in, which doesn't really make any sense, and it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't have found the dog later. But that's Steve was rationalizing shit from a young age, evidently. So as they are looking for Nell, we have this whole thing with, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit because there's a significant scene in the funeral parlor, but I'm going to wrap up with everything that happened here instead. We have Olivia looking around for Nell, and eventually she comes across this room where the water is pouring in through the flue of the fireplace, and she goes in and closes it, and then she hears this door knob rattling. And she goes and opens it, and there is a little boy looking ghostly AF in a wheelchair, and it looks like was just waiting for her to open the door and wheels past her. And there's also, at one point, there's an old woman in that bed, like as she's walking past it, we see her behind. And this little boy in the wheelchair, like she's mentioned him in her deja vu thing. So clearly this is an old resident of the house. But she turns and follows the progress that he's making down the hall. But when she turns, he's gone. And then when the camera swings back around, she's gone. And her flashlight is on the floor. And her husband is like, what the fuck? Where did she go? And I have to wonder what he's thinking is happening here. Because it's one thing for her to sort of like wander off. It's another thing for her to drop her flashlight and wander off. And so he keeps seeing her down different hallways, and he's calling to her like, hey, girl, what's going on? Liv, what are you doing? And he's following her, and she's never there. He gets to like a dead end a couple of times, and she isn't there. And then finally he turns and he sees her at the head of the stairs in front of this huge window, and he yells for her to be careful because the glass in this house is apparently fragile enough that the storm is blowing it out. And she's standing right in front of this window when the glass breaks. And like, if she had actually been standing there, she would have been sliced up. But the glass breaks, he straightens, he looks, and it looks as if, and I may be wrong about this, it looks as if the glass isn't even broken when he stands up. It's not even as if, oh yeah, she wasn't standing there, the glass broke, but she wasn't there. The glass is fine. He heard it break, he saw it break, and he saw her standing there. But then when he straightens, the windows are whole again, and she's gone. What does he tell himself about what happened there? I really want to know what he fucking tells himself. And eventually, he turns back around, and she is like crouching, or not even crouching, she's kneeling on the floor in the spot where he found her flashlight, looking around, genuinely confused. And she's lost time and doesn't know what happened. And I have to wonder, it looked as if she had been walking around. It looked as if she dropped her flashlight. What if the same thing was sort of going on with her as was going on with Nellie, where she was like in a different dimension, but was actually sitting there the whole time, and she dropped her flashlight, but she was there, and he just could not like see or hear her. And this is when they hear the kids scream, and they run down, and you know the kids are talking about the dog that they saw run through, and they turn around, and all of a sudden there's Nellie. And Nellie is like, I was here the whole time, and I was telling you that I was here, and you guys couldn't see me or hear me. I was here the whole time. And obvious metaphor here, just her trying to get help, and nobody actually being there for her. Nobody being able to, not even were they seeing and ignoring her. It was simply as if it wasn't happening to them, which is a whole other level of feeling like nobody gives a shit, you know, where you begin to wonder, am I crazy? Is it me? So then to wrap up with the funeral, we finally have the confrontation. First, we have the revelation that Shirley, she's been unknowingly taking this money. Her husband set up a private bank account to keep it in. And he basically tells her, you've been sort of running the business into the ground. And I needed to take it in order to sustain that. And can't you just like rethink how you're like seeing this and instead picture it as that money went to a good cause and helped a bunch of people who were going through like the worst time of their lives? And she does not want to hear it. She says, do you have any idea how much you've humiliated me? Which is fair. And then later on, she finds him and Theo apparently making out in one of the rooms when she goes to get her kit to fix Nell's makeup. And I truly can't tell. I'm going back to see it. But she opens the door and she sees them there. And there was this like, it's not, they weren't actually touching. Well, he was, but she wasn't kissing him. It was almost looking like Theo was trying to kiss him and he was holding her off him. That's what it looked like to me. Like maybe she drank too much and was trying something on. He was pushing her back. And it looked to Shirley like he was fucking around, but I don't think that's actually what was happening. I think Theo's drunk and she was like about to make a move on him or just do something. And he was like, girl, what are you doing? You're drunk. I really think that's what was going on here. And Shirley just already feels like the two of them were sort of in cahoots behind her back. And so leaps to the wrong conclusion, which I can't even really like blame her for, because at this point you weren't going to be trusting anybody. And the particular thing that Shirley's mad about isn't even just taking the money, but also the fact that Theo took the money and has been living under her roof, rent-free. And Theo tries to be like, I offered to pay rent, and Shirley's just like, shut up and get the fuck out. Like, sincerely, just leave. Theo is surprisingly unwilling to leave. Like, honestly, if I were Theo, I would be like, goodbye, fine. But she actually says to Kevin at one point, like, do I really have to move out? And I have to think that's the drunkenness talking. Because I feel like sober Theo would never beg or ask, like, no, but can I stay? I feel like sober Theo would be like, all right, fine. I can afford it. Okay, I'm leaving, you know? I don't know if she can afford it anymore, because God knows how much her PhD fucking cost. But, yeah, I'm just sort of wondering, once the light of day hits and she's sobered up, how she's going to feel about this whole thing. And will Shirley listen to either of them when they try and tell her nothing actually happened between the two of us? It doesn't matter at this point, because the betrayal is a whole different thing. So probably it won't matter to her. And then there's the confrontation between Steve and their dad. And I say the confrontation between him and their dad, even though everybody else was there for it, mostly because Steve is really the one who refuses to listen. And like I said, makes a ton of accusations about their dad hiding stuff about mental health from them because he's clearly worried about his own mental health. And there's just like a whole thing here. And his father tries to tell him that, you know, it was the house. You've never understood the house. Luke knows that Nellie didn't kill herself, that her mother didn't kill herself. And he will fucking not entertain even the conversation. And I have to confess, guys, I understand that Steve doesn't, like, believe his father. But if you were in Steve's position, wouldn't you just, like, be interested to hear what story the guy is telling himself? Like, I guess the thing is supposed to be Steve's heard the story before. And so he's like, oh, not this fucking old chestnut again. But I don't know. I almost feel as if there's a sense of Steve never actually hearing the whole story. Like, every time that his dad started to tell him, this was how he reacted. And so I just have this sort of vibe that Steve has never actually heard the whole thing before. I may be wrong, but, you know, I don't know. And I'm just such a curious person, and I always want to see things from everybody else's perspective, which is part of the problem with being a Libra, because then you also want to take everybody's perspective into account, which leads to not being able to make a decision to save your life because you can see it from everybody's perspective. So maybe that's not a great thing, but I would always want to just hear them out. Just let them tell me what it is they think happened. I just want to know. And he doesn't. It's just a confrontation with the two of them and the lights going out again. And this is the moment when they all like sort of split up to try and deal with the generator and figure out what could be going on with that. And this is when Hugh, right before the lights actually went out, Shirley demanded to know who the fuck did this. And they turn and see a couple of buttons over Nellie's eyes. And Nellie, I think her nickname was Button. And then her mother gave her a gift of that box of buttons. So this seems like a reference to that specifically. But I don't really know what else it is other than just a reference, which it feels funny to me that like maybe there's a ghost that's just like, oh, hey, reminder, this is her nickname. Like, what's the point? I don't know. But Hugh is looking down at her in the coffin with the buttons over her eyes. And then when he turns and looks, he sees her as the bent neck lady off to the side. And he has this moment that for me was really touching, where he isn't frightened. He doesn't back away and go, oh my God, in horror. He looks so sad. And you see this moment of him like suddenly understanding that she was the bent neck lady. And he goes toward her. That's like true love. You see somebody as a terrifying apparition, but your reflex is not to be scared or terrified. It's to go toward them and try and reach out. And he walks toward her and says, Nell. And then it cuts back into the flashback. I was really touched by that moment and the fact that he was not afraid of her. He just wanted to see her and connect with her again, you know? And the episode ends with, first of all, we've got the lights are all still out. Nobody can figure out what the problem is because the whole rest of the block has light. The generator should be on, but it's not. And Luke finally turns away from the coffin and he says, Nellie didn't kill herself. And Dad knows it too. I don't think Mom did either. And this is what begins the whole like confrontation with Steve genuinely like beginning to freak out, screaming at his dad. And in the midst of this, he says, the wrong parent died. And as he says that, the whole fucking coffin goes crashing to the ground. And Nellie is like slumped out of it. And then the lights come back up again. And I really just want to be like, Steve, explain this. I genuinely want to know what you think happened. Because there was no ghost, but you said something particularly fucked up. And then she goes tumbling to the ground. And the lights come back on. All at once. Explain that shit, sir. You got nothing. Because there's nothing to be said. Because that shit is supernatural. It's weird and creepy. And you have to admit that. And there's a sense of him almost knowing that. As he's moving the coffin so that it straightens out, he looks like he's about to burst into tears. And I really think it's because he's like the last vestiges of fucking sanity are beginning to flee. He's beginning to really realize that there isn't anything that you can say to explain this. It doesn't make any fucking sense. And This is when Shirley goes to get her kit because her makeup got messed up from falling over. And the last scene is of Luke looking at Nellie in the casket and remembering as a little boy saying to her, I thought the house things had got you. I thought they took you. Don't worry. I'm never going to let the house do anything to you. And he's just obviously realizing that he didn't keep his promise. That shit happened. And I can't help but imagine that he blames the fact that he's been using for the fact that he wasn't there for her the way that he should have been to support her throughout all of this. And it ends as they all walk out with Nell's baby voice saying, I was right there. I was right there. And you didn't see me the whole time. I was right here. None of you could see me. And the camera turns around and she is standing there next to the coffin in the bent neck lady, like, you know, outfit and everything. And her face is genuinely like, as much as she is scary, she looks so sad. That was really what I got from that, was this like just desperation in her face. And there was just nothing to be done. Nobody knows she's there. So that was a really heart-wrenching episode, guys. Again, I'll be doing a live watch for the next one. I don't know when. Keep your eye out on the Twitter and the Facebook page for the patrons. And I'll try and alert you within like, you know, an hour or half an hour to an hour before I do it. It's always sort of an impromptu thing. I never really know when I'm going to have the time. But, you know, I do my best to let you guys know within a time frame that's somewhat reasonable. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm way over time, but thank you again to Candace for commissioning this. Thank you all for hanging out with me. I hope you're enjoying the coverage, and I will be seeing you soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.